Welcome back to another daily devotion. Today we're in Acts chapter 25. Acts 25 is really a neat passage because it's the fulfillment of a promise that the Lord gave earlier on in Acts. Now, as we look down at Acts 25, we see that Paul is currently imprisoned. He's incarcerated. There was the riot that happened. Acts 24 records how Paul was taken into custody because the Jews rioted. They wanted to kill Paul. So the Romans stepped in this commotion, and they pulled Paul out of the crowd. They ended up saving his life. And because of the charges that the Jews brought against them, Paul was sent down to Caesarea, and in Caesarea, Paul was brought before the governor Felix, and Felix kept Paul imprisoned for a period of 2 years. Paul had freedom where he could entertain guests, and he could have his friends come and minister to his needs, and every now and again, Felix would hear Paul teach, but Felix knew that Paul hadn't done anything that was worthy of being imprisoned, but he wanted to do a favor for the Jews, and so he kept Paul imprisoned during this time. Well, Acts 25 begins, and there's a new governor who has taken over for Felix, and that is Festus. And so you have Festus taking over, and he's starting to get the lay of the land, and he's headquartered there in Caesarea, but he goes up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with the Jews, and that's where he hears about Paul's case, and they say, hey, we want to bring charges against this man, and they want to try him in Jerusalem. And Felix or Festus tells them, hey, no, bring your charges and we'll convene a tribunal down in Caesarea. And so they bring this tribunal together, they bring these charges, and what Luke records in verse 7 is that they bring these serious charges against him, but they're charges that they could not prove. It was basically, Paul hadn't done anything to violate the law of God recorded in the Old Testament, or the law of the Romans. Like, Paul was innocent of this. If he was guilty, he would have been convicted long ago. But he hadn't done anything wrong. Later on, we see that Festus affirms this fact, saying, hey, he hasn't done anything wrong. It's just a matter of a religious dispute between Paul and this group of Jews. And so during this tribunal, Paul makes his defense, saying that he hasn't done anything to violate the law of the Jews or the law of the Romans, and that he's innocent of this. Now, it's at this point that the Jews are insisting that Paul be tried in Jerusalem. They want him to be kind of in their home field advantage. And Paul knows that if he's tried in Jerusalem, he's not going to get a fair trial. And so you have the governor saying, well, will you consent to being tried in Jerusalem? It's at this point that Paul, as a Roman citizen, knows his rights, and he says, rather than being tried in Jerusalem, where it's not going to be a fair trial, I appeal to Caesar. And at that point, as a Roman citizen, Paul had that legal right. And so he's now going to be sent to Rome to appeal to Caesar. Well, it's at this point in verse 13 that King Agrippa and his wife Bernice, they come for a visit. And as Festus is entertaining them, he tells them about Paul. And it's through this interaction that Paul is able to have an audience with the king and with his wife. It's really kind of a neat thing to see that as Festus is explaining what's going on with Paul, that King Agrippa and his wife, they say, we want to hear what this guy has to say. And so you get down to verse 23. It says, on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice among great pomp, they entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So you have Festus, the governor, you have King Agrippa and his wife, and then you have the commanders and then the prominent men of the city, this really important delegation that is brought in, and Paul's able to make his defense before them. Really, what happens here in Acts 25 is the beginning of what God promised earlier on in Acts. You'll remember that when Paul was saved on the road to Damascus, and the Lord appeared to him and called him when the Lord sent a message by Ananias to Paul. Listen to what the Lord says in Acts 8 and verse 15. It says, "But the Lord said, 'Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine.'" And how was Paul to be a chosen instrument of God? Well, the Lord says, "He is an instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the sons of Israel. And I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." And so the Lord had revealed to Ananias, saying, hey, Paul is a special instrument. He's going to bring the gospel, not just before the Jews and not just before the Gentiles, but before kings. And here we see that Paul had already been before the governors, but now he's brought before the kings and these important individuals, leaders within the city. And eventually what we're going to see in Acts is that Paul eventually makes his way to Rome, and he's able to bring the gospel to Caesar. Paul talks about this while he's in Rome, in prison, in Philippians chapter 1. He says, you know what? The circumstances of my imprisonment have turned out for the good. And that the whole Praetorian Guard, like Caesar's personal bodyguards, I've been able to share the gospel with them. And the brethren have been encouraged, and they're able to speak without fear because of my imprisonment. The Lord, he knew what he was doing. And so the Lord orchestrated these circumstances so that Paul was in prison and he was able to reach a people group that he would never be able to reach otherwise. Sometimes we think of, Paul going into prison, he was able to reach the worst of the worst and the lowest strata of society. Really, God's plan was, I'm gonna bring him to the point of imprisonment, so he's going to stand before the highest strata of society. He's going to stand before kings and rulers, and he's going to proclaim my name. And that's beginning to happen as we see in Acts 24 and 25, and we're going to see it later on in the book of Acts. So it's neat to see God's providence at work, bringing the gospel to people, even to kings and rulers. So hope you're encouraged today. Read through Acts 25 and get into the details of that. But until next time, God bless, and we'll see you later.